Hey, it's Trey. The 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America arrives this year on the 4th of July, in the midst of an intense debate over American history. President Donald Trump has long claimed the political left has made a concerted effort over the past 10 years to rewrite history.
Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children.
Just weeks after his second inauguration, Trump signed an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. It orders federal cultural institutions to get rid of divisive race-centered ideology from their programs, signage, and exhibits.
Against every law of society and nature, our children are taught in school to hate their own country and to believe that the men and women who built it were not heroes, but that were villains.
Following his executive order, the Smithsonian Institution and the National Park Service began reviewing content for what the order called improper, divisive, or anti-American ideology and negative history. Against this backdrop came the renowned filmmaker Ken Burns' latest public television history series, The American Revolution. In an interview with Newsweek, Burns said he wanted to strip away the romanticized myths of the nation's origin story.
A lot of this stuff has its own sort of iconography and sort of romanticism attached to it. I want to know what really happened. And so you'll get to know 20, 25 battles. You'll get to know lots of social movements that are taking place. You'll understand the role of women. You'll understand the role of enslaved and free black people and the native people at the edges, as well as those great founders. And nothing takes away from anybody. Those big ideas become even bigger when you realize what actually took place. This is not counsel. It's not woke. It's just a good story.
Conservative critics disagreed. The New York Post said it made a woke mockery of America's founding. The National Review said it was ahistorical. The Wall Street Journal called it slow and sanctimonious. Meanwhile, the New York Times said it was sneakily provocative. One op-ed columnist called it magnificent. And Variety said it presented a treasure trove of oft-forgotten history. Coming up, what a group of West Virginians think about our history. And perhaps even more important, how the past helps define our future. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells stories about the things that divide us and bring us together. I'm Trey Kay. Last fall, prior to the release of Ken Burns' The American Revolution, I held a discussion at Shepherd University with early American historians about the well-known filmmaker's take on the war. The PBS series emphasized that the War for Independence was not only a revolution waged against Britain's king and parliament, but a violent civil war that pitted colonists against one another. The series also widened the American Revolution's traditional cast of characters beyond patriots and redcoats to include women, indigenous people, and free and enslaved Black Americans. And it demonstrated that the new nation's goals were not just based on noble concepts like liberty and equality, but on economic opportunity. Now that the series has aired, I wanted to hear what viewers thought. So several weeks ago, I brought together professional and student scholars from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, for a community conversation on Ken Burns' The American Revolution. Thank you for joining us here at the Brad D. Smith Center for Business and Innovation on the campus of Marshall University. Tonight, We came together to hear what they thought about Burns' fuller, warts and all story of the Revolution and to gauge its relevance for the future. I'm joined on stage by Kevin Barksdale, a professor of early American history at Marshall, George Davis, an associate professor of political science at Marshall, and 3 Marshall students who you'll learn more about in a moment. In the opening minutes of the first episode, Ken Burns focuses on the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. It was a centuries-old participatory democracy which Benjamin Franklin mentioned in a letter 22 years before the Declaration of Independence, suggesting the 13 colonies form a similar union. This sequence drew some of the sharpest criticism, especially from conservatives, who said Burns credited Native Americans with the inspiration for the U.S. Constitution and representational democracy. It's a claim that Burns' production company denies.
So let's talk about this. Professor Kevin Barksdale, you are a historian. Your research has focused on the Appalachian frontier during the time of the Revolution and on Southeastern Native people. What do you think of Ken Burns' claim that you can't understand the story of the American Revolution without telling the stories of Native Americans?
One of the problems that happens early on is that you get something called cameo history, where Native Americans are sort of just grafted on, and they're not given agency, and they don't play a major role in historical events. This goes all the way back into pretty much anything with the 18th century. But Burns does a great job, I think, in the documentary of trying to integrate the story of the indigenous people of the Americas.
And I want to ask you briefly before I get to others, because your focus is this part of America during this history. How was the Revolutionary War being fought in Western Virginia and the Ohio Valley frontier? What was it similar or different than how it was being fought on the coast and in New England?
Yeah, I mean, I think that something that really jumped out at me was the similarity in experiences during the American Revolution of rural America. We think of the sort of large pitched battles and fall of the Continental Army, but within rural America, and Appalachia included, but wherever it was, it really did have that kind of feeling of the Civil War. And I think it's analogous to what the actual American Civil War looked like in this area, which a lot of smaller skirmishes. You don't have a lot of British. There are almost no British regulars out here, and so you get a lot of militias. You get a lot of small scale battles. A lot of under the cloak of darkness violence on both sides. I think the American Revolution was significantly more dangerous in that context in the Appalachians or in rural America than I think people really understand.
Professor George Davis, you're nodding your head a lot.
Well, I think there are people in the colonies at this time who really didn't even know the revolution was happening because it wasn't happening to them, right? I agree with Kevin that Ken Burns does a pretty good job of kind of bringing in that indigenous perspective, but I would add that I don't know that there is an indigenous perspective as much as there are multiple indigenous perspectives.
Okay, I get that. Now, you were raised in the northern part of New York. There's a lot about the Iroquois history that was in the textbooks, maybe perhaps more than we learned here in West Virginia. Can you say more about what it is that you learned about this history that is referred to in this opening sequence of Ken Burns' documentary about the Iroquois Confederacy?
There is sort of a mythology that the Iroquois had this confederacy and Ben Franklin really appreciated it and convinced the other framers, whatever that means, that this is worth pursuing, and it really had an influence on how the revolution, whether or not the revolution happened. And I think it's a little too easy to make that leap. One of the things, again, as the documentary points out, one of the things that the colonists wanted from the British was for them to break a treaty with the Iroquois so they could expand westward. So it wasn't, this complete celebration of indigenous history that I think that story sometimes makes it out.
Could I add something, Trey?
Yeah, please.
I think one of the things that doesn't get brought out in the documentary is the fact the Iroquois Confederacy existed for a reason, and that was the projection of power pre-contact in the Americas against other indigenous groups. I mean, The Ohio Indians that people here know so well, they're out here. They're the Delaware, the Shawnee. They're out here because they're driven west by the power of the Iroquois Confederacy. I'll say one other thing. They weren't all equal partners. The six groups in the Iroquois, this wasn't a democracy in that sense. The Mohawks were stronger than the Tuscarora and on and on and on. And the Iroquois Confederacy in no way, shape, or form looked like the Articles of Confederation government or that. It was much more complex. There were a lot of political and military and economic imbalances within it. So I just wanted to point that out.
Well, I'm glad you did. I want to pivot to our students here. Let me go to William Harrison.
William Harrison is one of our 3 student panelists. He's 29 and a freshman, currently majoring in physics.
William, you went through school. You were educated here in West Virginia. When you think of the highlight reel of your version of the American Revolution, of what you learned in school, how did that highlight reel compare to what it is that you saw in this 6-part documentary?
It was vastly different. So growing up here in West Virginia, they romanticized the American Revolution very heavily. We focused on what we won, our battles, rather than how we treated the people that helped us along the way.
Can you think of one particular part of the documentary that really stuck out to you that way?
So one of the things that stuck out to me the most was how the women would go in after the battles and clean up. They picked up the bodies, they buried the bodies, they handled all of that. I had no clue. I did not know about that at all.
I definitely feel like in school you don't talk about or hear about the enslaved people, the displacement of Native Americans, and also all the struggles that women went through.
That's political science major Adriana Raymore. She's 22 years old and graduates this spring.
I feel like watching the documentary definitely changed my perspective on how I would fit into the nation's origin story, because being a young Black American woman, it's definitely hard to see where we would fit in. As they kind of mentioned, it was more talked about of what the wealthy white women did. So I feel like our part of history kind of goes unnoticed and we're kind of hidden from that. So we don't really know what victories or what we did during that period of time.
Historian Kevin Barksdale.
All the women that are quoted in the documentary are people like Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren, and these are very wealthy women, very deeply connected women. And the reason we have those quotes is because they were part of families in which the archives in which they lived preserved those records. We don't have any idea what women thought on the frontier or what women that were working on farms in the South or something. We don't have that. How revolutionary was the revolution to those kind of women? We don't know the answers to those questions.
E. Provost is another student panelist. She is 22 and a poli-sci major who graduates this fall. I asked her how the things she learned from the PBS series landed with her.
I think the part that makes me feel the most uncomfortable is whenever they said that the Native Americans probably would have been better off if we just never came here. That's a really uncomfortable truth to sit with. I mean, it's just hard to reconcile with, because here we are on this land and here we are reaping the benefits of their injustices. One part that made me a lot more appreciative is the fact that so many people were willing to get together to do something against their government. You kind of see almost this caste system of injustices going on. There's a British government, and then there's the colonists or patriots or framers, whatever you want to call them, and then there's the people below them. Maybe the patriots didn't mean to, but I think that inadvertently the colonists fighting to overcome their injustices gave the framework to a lot of those people to fight back against their injustices. I mean, the Constitution came out of it. The Constitution gave us a legal framework to overturn a lot of the issues that occurred during the Revolution.
George, you're nodding your head as they're talking. I mean, can you amplify, or do you think they're on point here?
It's easy sometimes, in academia or, people sort of critically can look at the revolution or the founding or whatever and say this was terrible, and they can look at, is there hypocrisy there with respect to, let's say, the Iroquois or whatever. But I think it's really important to think about how the ideals, at least, right, that come out of the Revolution, the founding, the Declaration of Independence, have been used, I think that's a great point, have been used for multiple social justice issues since then.
Kevin Barksdale, you have said to us that there is no United States without the dispossession of Native Americans. Why is it that Americans need to know about that in their history of the American Revolution?
Wow, I think there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, if you care about historical accuracy, you need to know about that, and if you kind of want to.
But isn't that kind of shameful history? Or when I'm in first or second grade and I put my tricorner hat on, and it doesn't make me very proud of my nation.
Yeah, I have to be honest, Trey. I have a very difficult time when individuals wrap their identity up in things that happened 250 years ago. It's difficult for me to put myself there. My experience with students is that students want unvarnished history. They don't want the Disney version of American history. That's boring, right? And that's not the way it works. In my classes, I try to point out that these are people that we're talking about. They're flawed humans with different kind of ambitions and desires and counter ambitions. And if you think about the past in that kind of way, it allows you to put yourself back there and maybe relate to what's going on and think about those sorts of things. So I've never experienced students coming up to me and say, look, I want you to simplify this, romanticize this, and I don't want any of the most unsavory aspects of it to come about because it hurts my feelings. It offends me. I don't have that experience, and I don't understand that experience. I don't understand that.
Well, E is sitting right next to you, and she's nodding her head as you're saying that. What are you thinking as he's saying that?
I just fully agree. I mean, I feel like the sanitized version of history that a lot of people think that they want, or they think that they want for their children, is it's unproductive and it's uninvolving and it's apathetic.
Adriana, what do you think about what she's mentioning about a sanitized version of history?
I would have to agree. I feel like growing up in school, I definitely had like a sanitized version of history. We did not fully talk about the hard topics, and I feel like that's what makes people grow in a sense.
Could I just jump in real quick?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what everybody's saying. I think how Kevin put it in the sense of students don't want this history is really important. I think another reason, though, to focus on it and to talk about it and discuss it is because, part of the American story is to believe in things like liberty and equality and self-determination, right? And we don't take a lot of time to really think about what those terms mean. And unless we really interrogate our history, interrogate what they meant to, let's say, the colonists, and they didn't always follow those ideals, they didn't live up to their own standards, like that makes us think, like, what do we mean when we actually use these terms? Because we use them a lot. Probably if we started going around the room and said, define liberty for me, we'd get a lot of different definitions. And these are the things we fight about now, and we don't ever interrogate. What does that actually mean to value equality? Without telling these stories, we can't have a sense of what it means.
Our conversation then shifted gears to focus on the philosophical ideals and virtues of the Revolution. While the founders championed equality and the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they were not willing to extend those rights to everyone, including the poor, women, and blacks. As one scholar in the series says, democracy came to America not as a direct purpose of the American Revolution, but as an unintended cost. Here's early American historian Kevin Barksdale.
I'll start off by saying I would imagine that was probably one of the more controversial sections of the Burns documentary. I mean, that's a very powerful statement that democracy was incidental to the American Revolution. And all you need to do is look to see what happens when the American Revolution ends and you have basically a counter-revolution to sort of put the aspects of democracy back in the bottle. You look at Virginia, if you own 50 acres of land in 7 counties, you could vote. I mean, these were not particularly egalitarian documents that they put together. That's not what they wanted. They wanted to control the revolution. They embraced this sort of revolutionary populism until it got out of control. I mean, the French Revolution terrified them later on, but one of the reasons why they wanted landed men to basically have political powers because they believed that if you didn't own land, that you could easily be bribed or influenced in other ways. So they believed these kinds of men, educated, landed men, would be beyond that. They wouldn't be as susceptible to influence and that sort of thing.
Okay, George Davis, as we are 250 years later, we still have disparities. I mean, they're different than they were at that time, and they continue today. So what was so revolutionary about the American Revolution?
There are people who argue that it really wasn't that revolutionary, right? So for a lot of people, the economic system didn't change drastically. If you were one of those people who were, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Adams, like it didn't change drastically your life. It might have given you even more advantages. On the other hand, I think it was a revolution in the sense that it is a model of declaring independence from a government that you see as tyrannical, justified or not, we can certainly get into that, but in declaring your independence as a free and equal people that then, as students have pointed out on the panel, like kind of inspires movements going forward. So just the notion that that is possible, that's a revolution.
Again, student E. Provost.
I think that it's really interesting, like how the founding fathers, they described the land in America as her and she. Like the visual representations of the land were always this like beautiful white woman, like manifest destiny, like this beautiful angel woman flying over the territories. They used images of these people to somehow justify their acquisition of the land. I think it's just so ironic and hypocritical that they were purposefully not allowing them to have a say in the government while also using them to their privilege and using them to somehow paint themselves as more righteous.
Historian Kevin Barksdale.
I think that's a very astute point, and they did the same thing with Native Americans. I mean, they dressed up as the American Indian for the Boston Tea Party and these sorts of things, so they sort of co-opted that image.
Well, Kevin Barksdale, you had told us before we talked here that one of the driving forces in the independence movement was the colony's own imperialism. Can you explain that?
So what I meant by that was that, and this isn't my idea, but essentially the American Revolution was fought for a subset of Americans. I'll give you an example, George Washington. Washington was a prolific land speculator, owned land on here. Ben Franklin, a lot of the Patriot leaders had financial investments in Western land, Native American land. And the British, after the French and Indian War, pull back on it. The French and Indian War effectively bankrupts the British. So the British begin to try to restrict Western expansion because it leads to very expensive and bloody Native American warfare. But the American Revolution, I mean, that's a big part of it, is the expansion of this territory.
George Davis, the state's first attempt to form a federal government was the Articles of Confederation, and it failed. And it failed because it was too focused on the autonomy of the states. What do you think the framers were worried about?
It's a really interesting history, and it gets back to sort of that story that we learn in high school, whatever. There's a king, he's mean to us, we get pissed off about it. Can I say that? And I'm saying we, they fight a revolution, there's a Declaration of Independence, they win the revolution, George Washington becomes the president, there's a constitution, and everybody lives happily ever after. What is never in that story, or rarely in that story, is that we had a constitution before the Constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. It was ratified before the war was over. So in some ways, you could argue that that is more the vision that the revolutionaries saw for the United States than the Constitution we end up with. And that Constitution didn't have an executive branch, and the national government had very little power, and the states were still the sovereign entities in the Confederacy, right? There was no guarantee that this thing was going to hold together. I mean, to give the the framers of the Constitution, credit, I think some of their response to the Articles of Confederation was this thing might fall apart.
So, William Harrison, when you were learning history, was there kind of a thing like, we know this is always going to work forever and ever?
It's inevitable, I think, is the way you kind of would put it, yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of. It was like they expected it to work, but will it always work was kind of up in the air, I guess.
Do you feel like it's up in the air now?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, because there's so much things that are happening now that nobody is combating.
The framers were not arguing for a strong executive. Today, the United States has a very strong executive who has claimed broad powers and a weak Congress that is not acting to check expansion. So what does that say about the strength of our Constitution's system of checks and balances?
Professor George Davis.
As an academic, my job is often, I think, to really just complicate things and to say there's not a simple story. Yeah, I mean, there's not a simple answer to a question like that, right? So I think I know the question you're asking, but what I would say is that immediately you end up with these branches having separate powers, fighting for superiority, fighting to be the most important. And the expansion of executive power happens immediately. I mean, Marbury versus Madison was over whether or not the Jefferson administration had to do what his predecessor did before he became president. So the expansion of executive power at the expense of Congress is a pretty old story in the United States. And you're absolutely right the way you framed it. I mean, Congress in some ways has given up a lot of these powers that it has to check the executive branch for a variety of reasons. But, I mean, where do you want to start? Lincoln used executive power pretty strongly without congressional authority during the Civil War. So I don't want it to sound like this is a relatively new phenomena, right? We certainly can talk about how it is a phenomenon now, but it's certainly not a new one.
So I've got two more questions for Adriana and E and William, and before I ask them, audience, I want to encourage you to listen closely because I'd like your answers to many of these same questions. So, William, are there political concepts from the founding of our nation that feel relevant today to today's current issues?
There's a lot that shows up now that showed up then. For example, one of the things is the current administration and his use of executive power, trying to rewrite history, trying to romanticize what has happened, and then the SAVE Act, making it harder for people to vote.
William Harrison is talking about President Trump's legislative proposal called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. It would require voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship and a photo ID to vote.
Adriana, what political ideal from the founding of our nation feels most relevant to you right now, and why?
Probably the most ideal is the Fourth Amendment rights. Colonial anger over general warrants and broad search powers that were used by British officials that helped shape the constitutional protections against unreasonable searches and seizures that we're seeing right now. And I feel like it also kind of ties into concerns that you would see with digital surveillance and data privacy and the overall law enforcement authority.
Can I also add to that before the audience answers?
E. Provost.
Okay, so I think that one thing in the documentary that I feel like I really resonated with was the feeling of underrepresentation in your vote. I feel like that's part of the reason why people don't vote is because they feel like a lot of these politicians have been bought out by corporate donors. Since the Citizens United ruling, which led to super PACs and corporations being allowed to give unlimited funds to individual politicians, I feel like post that, there's this huge feeling of underrepresentation because who are the politicians going to listen to? The person who gave them $1 million or their constituents who just happen to check their name? I just feel like underrepresentation is huge, and that's part of the reason why so much revolutionary rhetoric is being used today.
Why do you think the language of the revolution is so enduring in our political discussion? We often hear modern political actors called kings, tyrants, patriots, and revolutionaries.
I just think that that's a fight that will never end. There will always be someone, I mean, like Abigail Adams said, like men would always be tyrants if they could. And I just feel like that's something that we're just inevitably always going to struggle with, and there's always going to be an imbalance of this power. And I think it's important to understand that this is an experiment. This is the American experiment, and that we trial and error things. And I think that using the same rhetoric of the revolution whenever we do see this perceived imbalance it works, and we hear it better.
As our conversation continues, questions start coming from our audience.
I noticed the film made a point to highlight that it took 20 years after Ben Franklin's illustration of the snake to really take hold in the culture of the revolution. Do you believe that's because the children at the time had grown up with the idea?
That's a great question. And George, you're nodding your head.
I'm shaking my head because it's a good question. I don't have a good answer. Yeah.
Coming up after a break, audience members join the conversation with their perspectives on the American Revolution. And we'll talk about the role of academia in creating shared history. You're listening to Us and Them. This show is supported in part by the CRC Foundation and WETA in Arlington, Virginia.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I'm talking with scholars, students, and others about the American Revolution and the meaning it holds for us today. Let's get back to our community conversation at the Brad D. Smith Center for Business and Innovation at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia.
All right, audience. Let me just give a few prompting questions, but I would love to see if somebody might have either a question for our professors or maybe a response about how the revolution is connecting with them today. So, for example, what responsibilities do our colleges and universities have in conversations about our nation's birth story?
My name's Leo. I'm a student at Marshall. This is my 4th year. I'm in the humanities department. I'm a classics major as well as a classical language major. So what I see in the ideals of the revolution is the intention of innovation and re-innovation. The questions that the founding fathers and the revolutionaries, as well as the Native Americans, as well as enslaved people, whether we have them documented or not, are trying to answer are the same questions that I see reflected in documents from the Roman Republic, documents from the Empire, documents from Persia and Greece. These are all the same questions. What right do I have to speak? What right do I have to think? What right do I have to tell somebody else what to do, perhaps? I think that they attempt to. But just like everybody else before them and who will come after them who've attempted to solve this issue, it is not easily solved, and they are still men. And throughout history, I think it's important that we never stop revisiting those issues because the tides of history will never stop.
The professors here, and E, you seem to be nodding your heads. So why don't you stay up there, please? Do you have a reaction to what she had to say?
Poli-sci major E. Provost.
Well, first of all, I think that that's a really good point. I think another myth about the framers that we hear is that this was some kind of unanimous decision, that they knew that we needed to do this, so we did this. And that's not true at all. Like, the Constitutional Convention was a huge debate. No one agreed. Whenever people say the framers thought this, that's which one? Like, and I think that that's part of the reason why it's so ignorant for people to not fully engage with our history in a critical way, because these people didn't agree. We shouldn't agree.
Yeah, over here, please.
My name is John Marr. The one thing I thought that did not really get discussed in the documentary, and not here tonight, is the contribution to America that is the American economic system. So, well, you start off with landed wealth, but you created a system that was perhaps the best in the world at creating wealth. Through that period, you went through landed wealth, and you transitioned into a tremendous expansion of mercantile wealth, right, through the merchant class, and then industrial wealth through manufacturing and transportation. And now we're in the era of digital wealth. And this system, with all its warts and bubbles and difficulties, has been able to manage that tremendous transition and address issues with the distribution of that wealth.
I mean, I think just to go back to the two points together.
Marshall Political Science Associate Professor George Davis.
You don't have an economic system that functions as well as ours does without those freedoms, those disagreements, those conflicts, fights over who controls the wealth, how should the wealth be distributed, right? Those are all political fights that can only take place they can take place in a unitary, powerful government. Someone decides how that's all going to work. We have the luxury of fighting it out, and I think we only fight that out because of what happens 250 years ago.
And thank you for your question. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Lacey Vinegar, and I wanted to answer your original question about what role do universities and colleges play in this. Sure. I'm an employee here, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the university, but just my own personal opinion. Obviously, I feel very strongly about higher ed, and I think part of the role of universities and colleges is to expand the worldview of people, because sometimes what we do learn in K-12 is very limited, and the perspective is very limited. Part of the role of universities and colleges is allowing people to expand their worldview, but then also create a safe place to have these discussions.
As Lacey Vinegar makes her point, I'm thinking of President Trump's executive order regarding how we teach history and the rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at colleges and universities. I asked Marshall University early American historian Kevin Barksdale, is this a climate where respectful campus debates can actually succeed?
Well, I'd be very reluctant to speak to all academic historians, but the ones that I know, the phrase indoctrination gets thrown around a lot about kind of what we're doing, and that's not at all what we try to do. I mean, what my responsibility as a professor of history here is to give students the tools to critically think about the past and come up with their own ideas. College professors are not in the indoctrination business. That's not how we're trained, and that's not how we're training our students. We are searching for the past, and we're searching for truth and to interpret the past and to give them the tools for them to do that themselves, not to regurgitate what we think, but so that they come up. That's the crown jewel of what we do, is to produce a professional historian that can do that themselves. That's what I want to do.
I think Dr. Barksdale said it very well.
Again, audience member Lacey Vinegar.
This is part of learning that critical thinking process, and I think these conversations are a great way to do that, regardless of what you're studying.
I don't know a professor that would not welcome a lively discussion in their classroom. We live for that.
Well, can I actually go back and just a quick part of that? I mean, I think there is a tendency, because we all talk about why is it important in higher education, right? There is a tendency to say, okay, this is kind of this, sacred institution on which these conversations are supposed to happen. And I actually don't think that's true. I think they should be happening at the grocery store. I think this should be happening, when you're waiting to pick up your car from the repair shop. I think we should be having these conversations outside the university. I think that's part of the problem.
And that part of the problem is there's even something about this tonight where I feel like sometimes when we talk about this history, it kind of seems as though we are in some type of ivory tower, as opposed to having just a common conversation, right? That's
absolutely.
Hi, Helen Zublik-Fain. I work for Cabell County School Systems. My comment is simply to say that Benjamin Franklin said, "Now we have a republic, if you can keep it." And to me, that means that we have to be bold. We have to not only have these debates within academia, but we also have to have those moments when you are sitting next to somebody who you disagree with and learn how to respectfully speak to them.
I feel like in some ways, a lot of these discussions I find on social media, it's a game of King of the Hill.
Very much so. We have to have the courage to stand up and say something.
Okay, but how do we do that? How do we get out of the King of the Hill game, and how do we get to a place where if somebody, like what Professor Barksdale is saying, this university, Marshall University, and all the universities in the nation, this is just an institution of indoctrination of liberal thought. How do you have that conversation with somebody who's saying that?
Instead of making statements, ask questions.
Nice. I like that. I like that. Can we go to you and then you?
My name is Mason Skidmore. I'm a Marshall student. And it was something small, but I noticed the film made a point to highlight that it took 20 years after Ben Franklin's illustration of the snake to really take hold in the culture of the Revolution. Do you believe that's because the children at the time had grown up with the idea? And even if it's not a specific image or phrase, do you see any ideas or messages from the past raising interest and popularity in today's young people or your students?
That's a great question. And George, you're nodding your head.
I'm shaking my head because it's a good question. I don't have a good answer.
I would add that it's not my responsibility to tell you what these sort of symbols and these ideas mean. It's a very personal thing. I mean, it's my responsibility to say, well, let's look at where this history comes from and where these symbols came from and what they meant to the people at the time. And then you decide what that means and whether it's significant or not. And I would ask you, what does that flag mean to you? I mean, is that something that's important to you, the Gadsden flag? I mean, does it resonate in your life?
I don't know if I could say any specific image, but I think the revolution, absolutely, the ideas, and it's like they said, it wasn't based off of ancient ideas, it wasn't based off ancient peoples, it was based off the idea that we're creating something new for the people. And I think that we should continue that in our democracy.
I mean, George and I win because you're asking that question and thinking about it. I mean, that's victory for me. You're thinking about the past. You're thinking about political ideas and symbolism, and you're in here talking about it. That's what we want our students to do. I mean, that's victory.
And that's the best question of anybody who's asked the question.
I'm a biochemistry student, so
I'll be in my office at 9 a.m. if you want to switch me.
Okay.
Okay, we got a question over here. Yes.
My name is Jones McKee, and I'm a student at Huntington Middle School, and I have a question for the professors.
Please.
What role do you think that France played in the American Revolution?
I wanted to say one thing about alliances with foreign countries in this documentary. And I think Burns, the person that made this documentary, wants Americans to understand the importance of these alliances, the importance of our alliance with France and the money they provided, the military support they provided, the political support that they provided, to understand that the American Revolution didn't happen just in North America. I mean, it happened all over the world, and that there were other nations that were integral. The Spain were integral to our success.
You touched on something on your answer about the importance of allyship during the Revolution. We are 250 years after the Revolution. I'm wondering how important our allyship is now.
I mean, I think that's Burns' point. I mean, there are a lot of things in that documentary that he wants Americans to reflect on now in contemporary politics, and one of those is that. I mean, how important are our alliances? How important are our, NATO and these various, alliances and institutions that are being questioned now? And I think he wants us to understand the country's founded on those alliances.
The last person to approach the microphone is Marshall student Michael Borsick. You might remember him. He has participated in several Us and Them dinner party episodes.
My question would be backing off of what Lacey said, is with the perception that colleges are indoctrinating per se, do you believe that some of that comes from the fact that, and I mean here in West Virginia, that not half our population has a college education? Do you believe it's a threat now with social media playing an influence in, kids that are 13 years old seeing political content and not understanding how to process it or what they are exactly seeing? And what do you think that means for the future of democracy?
As you were talking, I was thinking, Jefferson in some ways is a microcosm of that very question, because on one hand, he's romanticizing this yeoman farmer, like that's his ideal citizen. And in that respect, I think for him, citizenship is not something that happens in an institution. It's something that happens, living your life, self-determination, taking care of yourself and your family, working the land. That independence, that self-determination is that's what citizenship is about. On the other hand, Jefferson founds the University of Virginia because he thinks this educated citizenry is important enough that you should have these institutions to educate them. So, yes, do we need more citizenship education? Absolutely, but it doesn't always have to happen in this forum. It doesn't always have to happen in a classroom. It doesn't have to happen when someone like me, who has a degree in something that I spent a lot of time and money getting, basically says, well, here's what citizenship is. It's something we have to work out for ourselves. And if equality actually means something, then everybody in this room is equal in our capacities to be citizens. My degree doesn't matter.
I want to ask one last question, and Michael, thank you so much. That was a great question. I want to ask one last question before we wrap up here to our student panelists. And I'm going to go to you, Adriana, first. When you imagine yourselves 25 years from now, and we're at the 275th anniversary of the Declaration or the Revolution, what would you hope that Americans say we got right in this moment?
I would definitely say that I feel like just the general foundings, our political foundings, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, that's something I would hope we could say that we got right.
But the same question to you, William.
I agree with Adriana in the sense of like everything that happened afterwards of the revolution, but I also think that we need to improve upon our education system as well.
And how would we do that?
That is a loaded question. That I feel like it would take a lot to do to not overturn, but kind of reform our education, and instead of romanticizing and focusing on the wins, educate on everything.
If there was a poll of America and how we teach our history needs to have a heroic narrative on one hand, or you would be more on the warts and all.
Yeah, I think we need to teach everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, rather than just the one version, the American hero narrative.
Same question to you. At the 275th anniversary, what would you hope that Americans can say that we got right in this moment?
Okay. And I know I've already said this, but like just our willingness to constantly reconsider our past, and like they wanted a more perfect union, and just to continue refinding out what that means or what it doesn't mean.
Okay, thank you, E. So that's about all the time that we have for this evening. One of the things that Ken Burns reminds us of in this documentary is that the American Revolution wasn't just a war. It was the beginning of an argument about liberty, power, and belonging. An argument Americans have been having for nearly 250 years. The revolution gave us a powerful set of ideas: liberty, equality, representation. But it also left us with questions. Who belongs in that story? Who benefits from those ideals? And what responsibilities come with calling ourselves citizens? Those are questions that each generation of Americans has to wrestle with, and that's part of what we've been trying to do here tonight. But the conversation doesn't end here. I suggest that you invite someone to join you for a beer. Talk about this in your dorm rooms. Bring it into your classrooms. Discuss it with your family over supper. Argue a little bit and listen a little more. The American Revolution wasn't tidy, neither is democracy. And maybe that's the point. Oh, beautiful, far, spacious skies.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show was me, Trey Kay, Amy Eddings, and Kate Smith. Thanks to Dr. Mary Beth Beller and Dr. Monica Brooks of Marshall University, and Ryan Vance and Rick Bledsoe at Marshall University's Brad D. Smith Center for Business and Innovation. My colleagues Americo Valdez, Chris Barnhart, Bryce Smith, Ethan Raymond, and Troy Rankin at West Virginia Public Broadcasting, and Chloe Kuzius and Amy Lubinsky at WETA in Arlington, Virginia. Special thanks to Brian Hensley for recording our event, and to Nolan Duncan for taking photographs. Michael Lipton, Tristram Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Tris recently passed away. His music has been a part of the soul of Us and Them for years. I'm deeply grateful for all he gave to this work. Tris, we're going to miss you. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the CRC Foundation and WETA. America. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. America. Share them with us on our Facebook page or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Us Them Podcast. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. Hey, we'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.